sacrificial violence functions as a sort of dose of violence which, when injected into the social body, inoculates it against this much more devastating, generalized violence that contagiously spreads across it. How is plague a symbol and a symptom of the loss of differences, according to René Girard? So on one hand, there's a notion that there is some fundamentally social crisis, which is, again, described as a loss of differences, where essentially people cease to be able to differentiate among each other, differentiate between themselves and others. And this, for Girard, is simultaneous with a kind of descent into generalized conflict, where everyone becomes, as he says, doubles of the other. And this is the ultimate kind of violent extent of rivalry. So a plague symbolizes this because this is a process that, like a plague, spreads contagiously. In other words, we imagine two people begin fighting with each other, then others observing this mimetically or imitatively join into this conflict, perhaps taking sides, or perhaps adding a sort of third front of conflict. And this process spreads contagiously. So Girard is not the only person to observe this phenomenon in social settings. In fact, there's a famous sociological theory of riots that is quite similar, coming from the sociologist Mark Granovetter, where he argues that the riot is the result of a process of social contagion by which people who are, for one reason or another, willing to take risks they might not ordinarily take, such as throwing a brick through a window or starting a fire. Once they have set that example, others follow in their footsteps. And so, and this cascades across the entire group until you have a generalized riot, right? So this is or one way of describing this contagious theory of violence. So a plague symbolizes social collapse insofar as it is its operation or its procedure is the same, right? It's a contagious process, right, by which something that starts and is initially contained in a conflict, or perhaps in a lab, or perhaps in a particular place where a plague outbreak occurs, rapidly spreads, right? And it spreads exponentially, of course, because as soon as one person becomes infected, they can spread it to multiple other people. Similarly, as soon as one person becomes embroiled in this violent conflict, that violent conflict can then be spread out from them to further people, who then become nodes for the spread to expand even further. So this is how a plague resembles, and thus provides a kind of metaphor or symbol for a process of violent conflict, as Girard conceives of it. The second point would be that a plague also is symptomatic of a sort of social breakdown. So I think we can look at this in various ways that we can see plenty of examples of. So for Girard, the containment of this kind of conflict that I just described necessitates essentially something like borders or distinctions, right? It necessitates that people are separated in some way or another, such that they cannot become models for each other's violence, right? And such that the spread of the violence can be contained, right? So in other words, one particular social group might be consumed in this violence, but if there are other social groups that see themselves as fundamentally distinct from that group, they will remain aloof from it, right? So a situation of violent contagion is one in which these social groups have become undifferentiated, right? They've ceased to have clear lines drawn between them or borders drawn between them. So here we might think of how the most recent pandemic, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, originated, and the fact that, as is often observed, it was a product of globalization. What does globalization mean? Well, one thing it means is this kind of breaking down of borders, right? Nations become more connected to each other. They, the sort of barriers and distinctions between them begin to dissolve. And as a result, it becomes harder and harder to keep what's going on in one place apart from what's going on in another, right? So this is a basic notion of how the spread of a plague can be symptomatic of social phenomena, right? And we should note here that, globalization, as it was sort of sold and marketed in the 1990s as this sort of this process by which the world would become integrated, ideally into some kind of harmonious economic union, right, in which mutually beneficial trade would sort of create a rising tide that would lift all boats, right? So this is, where Girard sees a danger that these standard, more optimistic accounts don't see, which is that whether we like, borders or not, they can have this kind of crude function of blunting the spread of dangerous phenomena, right? Whether these be violence or whether these be, viral contagion. And of course, even though, because ideologically the public health establishment and epidemiological establishment of the world was committed to the basic precepts of globalization prior to the COVID pandemic, there were numerous documents from the WHO and other agencies condemning border closures, condemning travel bans as a way of containing contagion. But of course, as soon as people became aware of and intensely attuned to this risk, many countries essentially reneged on that prior commitment and decided to seal their borders. So, in this sense, they simply fell back into this ultimately quite primitive understanding, right, that, whether we like these borders or not in principle, they do have a kind of crude function of breaking the spread of contagions. But, of course, there are various ways that this was not practical in the long term, and most of these countries have ultimately given up on this kind of containment strategy. Similarly, we might say, and this relates to sort of Girard's diagnosis of the modern world, that, we can accept Girard's analysis of older societies in which social distinctions, right, and barriers could be used in this crude way to contain or break the spread of mimetic or contagious violence. But nevertheless, there are various reasons why such borders or barriers are unlikely to have a particularly long-lasting effect under modern conditions. And that is, for Girard, a sort of direct result of the logic of how the modern world has developed. So why and how does Girard associate the practice of sacrifice with the practice of vaccination? And why does he see these processes as fundamental to the origins of social institutions? So we might note here that, these various other kinds of containment measures brought to bear on the virus had, in some cases very limited or zero efficacy, in some cases at least short-term efficacy, as in the case of complete border closures. But of course, the ultimate thing that was proposed as the way to end the danger caused by the virus was the creation of vaccines. So here again, we have a kind of parallel to the realm of archaic society and religion, which Girard makes explicit in several of his books, which is that sacrifice, as he understands it, sacrificial violence, functions as a sort of dose of violence which, when injected into the social body, enables it to, or inoculates it against this much more devastating generalized violence that contagiously spreads across it, right? So the logic to vaccines is quite, the logical similarity to vaccines is quite similar, right? You take a small dose, and with that dose, if efficaciously applied, you are able to prevent the viral spread, right, or at least limit it. So for Girard, this is key to understanding why sacrifice is at the basis of all social institutions. As he sees it, societies in all times and places are threatened by the prospect of this kind of contagious violence that cascades across the entire social body and threatens to, consume and destroy it entirely. In fact, he argues that myths like the myth of the flood are again a kind of metaphor or symbol of this process by which, essentially society becomes completely consumed by its own violence, right, and essentially drowns in it. And so, one thing that can happen is for the society to simply destroy itself in this way. Another thing that can happen is that at some point in this process, a scapegoat is selected around whom the entire social body, or most of it anyway, can coalesce anew in their collective repudiation of this figure, right? And so the scapegoat is then viewed as the cause of is sort of ideologically and mythically construed as the cause of the violence and the threat overhanging the society. And through the violence discharged against the scapegoat, the social body can kind of find a new cohesion, right? So once again, this resembles a kind of process of inoculation by which a small dose can enable the body to protect itself from this much larger and fatal dose of violence. So for Girard, this emerges out of what he regards as a sort of spontaneous social process, right, by which when human groups reach a certain level of contagious violence, they either execute the scapegoat mechanism spontaneously in the early forms, as he describes it, and later ritualistically through the practice of sacrifice, right? So the practice of sacrifice, as he understands it, is discovered, right? And he explicitly sees it he calls it a technology. And it's discovered as a means of periodically discharging the dangers afflicting the society in the form of contagious violence. This, he argues, is the sort of basis of all stabilizing institutions, right? That they all emerge out of this original institution, which essentially sort of regularized and ritualized scapegoating violence in order to bring about, now deliberately rather than spontaneously, this effect of a sort of social vaccination against violence.
Hey, what's up? If you enjoyed this video, take a second to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We publish videos like this several times a week. And also, if you're interested in studying the work of René Girard on your own, we made an awesome, totally free 18-page study guide that you can download at girardcourse.com. It's expertly curated. It's in a logical sequence that's going to help you master his entire body of work at your own pace. You can go ahead and get that at girardcourse.com. All right, that's all I got for you. Over and out.